The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday afternoon at St. Pancras Station in London. People were rushing everywhere, trying to catch their trains or find shelter from the storm. Umbrellas bumped into each other. Suitcases rolled across the wet floor. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry, moving through the crowd like they were being chased by time itself. In the middle of all this chaos sat a public piano. Most days someone would stop and play a few notes. Maybe a child would bang on the keys while their parents laughed. Sometimes a brave tourist would attempt a simple tune. But right now, with the rain and the rush hour crowd, the piano sat empty and ignored. Then an old man appeared from the crowd. He looked to be in his early 70s, maybe older. His gray hair was a bit messy from the rain, and he wore an old tweed jacket that had seen better days. The brown patches on the elbows were worn thin. His shoes looked comfortable but old, the kind you keep wearing because they've molded perfectly to your feet over the years. He carried no umbrella, no briefcase, nothing that made him stand out. He was just another face in the crowd, the kind of person you'd walk past without a second thought. His name was Thomas, though nobody around him knew that. Nobody knew anything about him, really. He walked slowly toward the piano, each step careful and measured. His hands shook slightly as he reached out to touch the piano bench. For a moment he just stood there, staring at the keys like he was looking at an old friend he hadn't seen in years. A businessman rushing past glanced over and kept moving. A teenager scrolling through her phone didn't even look up. A mother pushing a stroller walked by, too focused on keeping her crying baby calm to notice the old man sitting down at the piano. Thomas settled onto the bench and adjusted his position. He straightened his back, rolled his shoulders once, and let out a long, slow breath. His hands hovered over the keys, trembling now more than before. Anyone watching closely might have thought he was nervous. But it wasn't nerves making his hands shake. It was something deeper, something that had been building inside him for a very long time. Then his fingers touched the keys, and everything changed. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, but within seconds the music began to flow like water finding its way downstream. It wasn't a song anyone recognized. It wasn't Beethoven or Mozart or any of the famous pieces people usually played on public pianos. This was something different, something original, something that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. The melody was haunting and beautiful. It carried sadness in it, yes, but also hope. It felt like watching the sun break through clouds after a storm. It felt like remembering someone you loved who was no longer there. It felt like 1,000 things all at once, and somehow, without words, it told a story. The businessman who had walked past a moment ago stopped mid-stride. He turned around, his phone call forgotten. The teenager looked up from her screen, her thumb frozen in mid-scroll. The mother with the crying baby paused, and strangely the baby stopped crying too, as if even a child could sense something special was happening. More people began to gather. First 5, then 10, then 20. They formed a loose circle around the piano, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Some had been rushing to catch trains. Others had been killing time between connections. A few had been having the worst day of their lives, drowning in problems that seemed impossible to solve. But now they all stood still, united by the music flowing from this old man's fingers. Thomas played with his eyes closed now. His whole body moved with the music, swaying gently as his hands danced across the keys. His fingers, which had trembled so badly just moments before, now moved with absolute confidence and grace. These were the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime with music. Someone who spoke in melodies the way most people spoke in words. The crowd continued to grow. 30 people, 40, 50. More kept coming, drawn by the sound echoing through the vast station. Trains came and went, but people missed them willingly, unable to pull themselves away. They stood in silence, many with tears streaming down their faces without really knowing why. An elderly woman near the front of the crowd gasped suddenly. She grabbed her friend's arm and whispered something urgently, but her friend shushed her gently. Whatever she wanted to say could wait. Right now, nothing mattered except the music. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, pulled out her phone and started recording. Her own hands were shaking as she held it up. She was a music student at one of London's top academies, and she knew immediately that what she was hearing was extraordinary. This wasn't just someone who could play piano. This was someone who understood music at a level most people never reach. Every note was perfect. Every transition was seamless. The emotion in every phrase was so raw, so honest, that it felt almost too personal to witness. Thomas moved from his original composition into Chopin. The notes of the nocturne in E-flat major filled the station, each one placed with such delicate care that it felt like watching a master painter work. Then he shifted into Rachmaninoff, the powerful chords rumbling through the space like distant thunder, then back to his own music, something soft and tender that sounded like a lullaby. More people gathered. The crowd was over 100 now, maybe more. They packed in tight, standing on tiptoes to see over shoulders, straining to get closer to the source of this unexpected magic. Some were crying openly. Others stood with their mouths slightly open, their faces showing pure wonder. A few had their eyes closed, just listening, letting the music wash over them like a healing wave. Nobody spoke. Nobody checked their phones except to record. Nobody worried about where they needed to be next. For these precious minutes, the entire chaotic world of the train station had stopped spinning. Time itself seemed to pause, held in place by the spell of this old man's music. Thomas played on, unaware or perhaps simply unconcerned with the crowd around him. His face was peaceful now, almost serene. Whatever demons or memories or emotions had made his hands tremble before seemed to have been released through the music. He was somewhere else entirely, lost in a world where only the notes mattered. And as the crowd watched this ordinary-looking old man create something so extraordinarily beautiful, they all shared the same unspoken thought. Who is this person? Where did he come from? And how could someone so talented be sitting here, playing a public piano in a train station like it was the most natural thing in the world? None of them could have guessed the answer. None of them could have known the incredible story behind those weathered hands and that worn tweed jacket. They were all about to find out something that would change not just their afternoon, but their entire perspective on what really matters in life. The music continued to flow, note after perfect note, building towards something none of them could see coming. Thomas had been playing for nearly 20 minutes when something shifted in the air. The crowd had grown so large that station security was starting to take notice. Over 200 people now stood in a massive semicircle around the piano, with more joining every minute. Some stood on benches to see better. Others held their children on their shoulders. The usual sounds of the station, the announcements and footsteps and rolling luggage all seemed to fade into the background. His fingers moved across the keys like they were telling a story only he could read. The music shifted again, this time into something slower, more melancholic. It was the kind of melody that reached inside your chest and squeezed your heart. Several people in the crowd had to wipe their eyes. A young man in a business suit just let the tears roll down his cheeks, not even bothering to hide them anymore. The music student who had been recording suddenly realized her phone was almost full. She had been filming for 18 minutes straight. Her arms ached from holding the phone up, but she couldn't stop. She knew she was witnessing something rare, something that might never happen again. Her training at the Royal Academy had exposed her to some of the finest pianists in the world. But this was different. This wasn't just technical perfection. This was a soul being poured out through 88 keys. She quickly posted the video to social media with shaking hands, typing a simple caption before returning her attention to the performance. Within seconds, the views started climbing. 10, then 50, then hundreds. People were already sharing it, commenting, tagging their friends. But she didn't notice any of that. Her eyes were locked on Thomas, tears blurring her vision. Near the front of the crowd, the elderly woman who had gasped earlier was now absolutely certain. She tugged on her companion's sleeve more urgently. "That's him," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I know it's him. I saw him perform at Royal Albert Hall in 1973. Thomas Whitmore. He was going to be the greatest pianist of his generation. Then he just vanished." Her friend looked skeptical. "That was over 50 years ago." "Are you sure?" "I'm certain," the old woman insisted. "I was a young music teacher then. I took my best students to see him perform. I've never forgotten that concert. Never forgot his face or the way he played. It's him. I'd stake my life on it." Thomas transitioned into another piece and the crowd collectively held its breath. This time it was something familiar, Claire de Lune. But the way he played it made it sound like a completely new composition. Every note carried weight, meaning history. He wasn't just playing the piece. He was living it. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, managed to squeeze through the crowd until she was standing right at the front. She stared up at Thomas with wide, amazed eyes. She had been taking piano lessons for 6 months and hated every minute of it. Her teacher was strict and the practice was boring. But watching this old man play, seeing the joy and pain and beauty flowing from his fingers, something clicked inside her. For the first time, she understood what music could really be. The crowd continued to swell. Station announcements about departing trains went unheard. People were literally missing their journeys home, and they didn't care. A businessman called his wife to say he'd be late, holding the phone away from his ear so she could hear the music through it. "You have to hear this," he kept saying. "You have to hear this." Thomas played for 40 minutes straight without stopping. His compositions flowed into classical pieces and back again, creating a seamless tapestry of sound. His weathered hands never faltered, never missed a note. The trembling from before had completely disappeared. He was in his element now, doing what he was born to do. Then, slowly, gently, he began to play his final piece. It was another original composition, softer than anything he'd played before. A lullaby. The melody was so tender, so filled with love and loss that it felt almost sacred. The massive crowd fell into an even deeper silence. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Even the babies stayed quiet. The notes floated through the air like snowflakes, each one precious and delicate. Thomas's eyes were closed and tears ran freely down his weathered cheeks. His whole body swayed with the music, completely lost in the emotion of it. This wasn't just a song. This was a goodbye. This was a love letter. This was a prayer. The final note hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. 200 people stood frozen, afraid that any sound might break the spell. Then it came. The applause. It started as a ripple and became a wave, crashing through the station like thunder. People clapped until their hands hurt. They cheered. They whistled. Many were openly sobbing, overwhelmed by what they'd just experienced. The sound was deafening, echoing off the high ceilings of the station. Thomas opened his eyes, seeming surprised to find such a huge crowd around him. He blinked a few times as if coming back from somewhere far away. Then he stood slowly, his knees a bit stiff from sitting so long, and gave a small, humble bow. The applause grew even louder. He tried to walk away, to disappear back into the crowd like he'd appeared from it. But the elderly woman pushed forward, calling out to him, "Mr. Whitmore." "Thomas Whitmore!" Thomas stopped and turned, confusion crossing his face. The woman was nearly his age, with silver hair and kind eyes that were swimming with tears. "I saw you perform in 1973, she said breathlessly. "At Royal Albert Hall, you were magnificent. The whole world was at your feet. What happened to you? You just disappeared. Everyone wondered where you'd gone." The crowd quieted again, sensing something important was happening. Thomas looked at the woman for a long moment, recognition slowly dawning in his eyes. "You were there?" he asked softly. "I was a music teacher. I brought my students. We talked about your performance for years afterward. You were destined for greatness. And then nothing. No more concerts. No recordings. It was like you'd never existed." Thomas's shoulders sagged slightly. He looked suddenly tired, older than his years. The energy that had sustained him through 40 minutes of playing seemed to drain away. "May I sit?" he asked quietly. Someone rushed to bring him a chair. He sat down heavily on a nearby bench, and the elderly woman sat beside him. A small group gathered close, while others in the crowd stayed back but listened intently. Station security had given up trying to disperse them. Even the guards wanted to hear what this mysterious pianist had to say. "I did disappear," Thomas began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had to." He told his story in simple words, but each sentence landed like a punch. He'd been 24 years old and on the verge of international fame. Recording contracts, concert tours, magazine covers, everything a young musician could dream of. And then his younger sister got sick, really sick. She had a rare disease, Thomas explained, his voice thick with emotion. The doctors gave her 2 years, maybe 3. She was only 19, full of life and dreams. She wanted to be a dancer. He paused, swallowing hard. "I couldn't leave her. I couldn't tour the world while she suffered. So I walked away from everything. I canceled the contracts. I turned down the offers. I moved back home to take care of her full time." The elderly woman gripped his hand. Others in the crowd were crying again, but for different reasons now. "She lived for 30 more years because of round-the-clock care," Thomas continued. "Experimental treatments, physical therapy, Doctor visits. I was with her every single day. I played piano for her when she was in pain. I held her hand through every procedure. I watched her fight with everything she had. He looked down at his hands, those magical hands that had just created such beauty. She passed away 5 years ago, and I realized I'd spent my entire fortune keeping her alive. I sold everything, including my grand piano, to pay for her final treatments. When she was gone, I had nothing left. No career to return to, no savings. The music world had moved on without me. Someone in the crowd let out a sob. The businessman wiped his eyes roughly with his sleeve. The little girl who had pushed to the front didn't understand everything, but she understood enough to know this man had given up something precious for someone he loved. I haven't played much since she died, Thomas said quietly. Today is her birthday. She would have been 64. I just needed to play for her one more time, to let her know I haven't forgotten, to tell her that it was all worth it. The silence that followed was profound, but it was broken by the sound of the music student's phone buzzing frantically. She glanced at it and her eyes went wide. The video she'd posted 20 minutes ago had gone viral. The music student stared at her phone in disbelief. The view count was climbing so fast the numbers seemed to blur. 1,000 views, 5,000, 10,000, 20. The comments were flooding in faster than she could read them. People from all over the world were watching Thomas's performance and sharing it with everyone they knew. "Oh my God," she whispered, then louder. "Oh my God. Sir, your performance is going viral. Millions of people are watching you right now." Thomas looked up at her, confused. "Viral? I don't understand." "The video of you playing. It's spreading across the internet. Everyone is seeing it. Everyone is talking about you." Thomas just shook his head slowly, like this information was too much to process. He'd spent 50 years in obscurity, forgotten by the world he'd once been destined to conquer. And now, because of a few minutes at a public piano, that world was suddenly paying attention again. But the attention wasn't just online. Within an hour, journalists started arriving at the station. They'd seen the video, recognized the location, and rushed over hoping to catch the mysterious pianist before he disappeared again. They found Thomas still sitting on the bench, surrounded by people who refused to leave, as if staying close to him might let them hold on to the magic a little longer. The questions came fast. "Mr. Whitmore, is it true you turned down a contract with Deutsche Grammophon? Did you ever regret your decision? Would you perform again? What was your sister's name?" Thomas answered some questions and ignored others. Yes, he'd turned down multiple recording contracts. No, he didn't regret his choice, not for a single second. His sister's name was Grace, and she'd been the kindest person he'd ever known. As for performing again, he didn't know. He hadn't thought that far ahead. A reporter from the BBC asked if she could interview him properly, maybe at his home. Thomas hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with all the attention. But something in the reporter's eyes, a genuine kindness rather than just hunger for a story, made him agree. "Come by tomorrow afternoon," he said quietly, giving her an address in East London. By evening, Thomas's story was everywhere. News websites ran headlines like, "The pianist who gave up fame for love and forgotten genius returns after 50 years. Music forums exploded with discussions. Professional pianists weighed in, analyzing his technique from the viral video. The consensus was unanimous. This wasn't just some talented amateur. This was world-class artistry. Classical music experts dug through archives and found old newspaper clippings from the early 70s. There were photos of a young Thomas, handsome and confident, his whole future gleaming before him. There were reviews of his early performances, critics falling over themselves with praise. "A once-in-a-generation talent," one had written. "The future of classical piano," declared another. But then there was nothing. The articles just stopped. One music historian found a brief mention in a 1974 newsletter about Thomas Whitmore withdrawing from the concert circuit due to family obligations. And that was it. He'd simply vanished, leaving behind only the memory of what might have been. Now the internet was trying to piece together the missing 50 years. People shared the story of his sacrifice. They talked about what it meant to give up everything for someone you loved. In a world that often felt shallow and self-centered, Thomas's choice struck a deep chord. The video wasn't just going viral because of the beautiful music. It was going viral because it reminded people that some things matter more than success and fame. The view count kept climbing. 5 million, 10 million, 20 million. The video was being shared in dozens of languages, crossing borders and cultures. A grandmother in Tokyo watched it and cried. A taxi driver in São Paulo played it for his passengers. A college student in Toronto sent it to her estranged father with a message that just said, "We should talk." Thomas, meanwhile, returned to his small flat in East London, completely unaware of the full scale of what was happening. He didn't own a computer. He had a basic phone that could make calls and nothing else. He lived simply, his pension covering rent and groceries with little left over. The flat was tidy but sparse. A small kitchen, a bedroom, a sitting room with an old sofa and a portable heater that sometimes worked. The only decoration of note was a wall covered in photographs. Grace at age 5, missing her front teeth. Grace as a teenager, dressed for her school dance. Grace in a hospital bed, thin and frail but smiling. Grace in a wheelchair in the park, feeding ducks. A lifetime of memories captured in fading photographs. That night, Thomas sat in his armchair and thought about the day. About how it had felt to play again, really play. Not just the occasional few minutes on his neighbor's keyboard, but a full, complete performance. His hands had remembered everything. Every technique he'd spent years perfecting. Every emotion he'd learned to channel through the keys. It had all still been there, waiting. He thought about Grace and wondered what she would have made of all this attention. She would have laughed, probably. She'd always had a good sense of humor, even during the hardest times. "There goes my famous brother," she used to joke when he'd play for her, wasting his talent on an audience of one. But he'd never seen it as a waste. Every note he'd played for her had been worth more than 1,000 concert halls full of applause. Across London, in a luxury penthouse overlooking the Thames, a man sat in his home office watching Thomas's video for the 5th time. His name was David Chen and he was 58 years old. He'd made his fortune in technology, building software companies that had revolutionized how businesses operated. He was worth billions, though very few people knew his name. He preferred it that way. David had been a classical music lover since childhood. His mother had been a piano teacher, and he'd grown up falling asleep to the sound of her students practicing scales. Even as his business empire grew, he'd maintained his love for music. He funded scholarships for music students. He'd donated millions to orchestras and conservatories. He sat on the board of several prestigious music institutions, but he did it all anonymously. He never attached his name to donations. He never sought recognition. His colleagues in the tech world didn't even know about this passion of his. They saw him as a hard-nosed businessman, brilliant and ruthless when necessary. They didn't know that he sometimes cried when listening to Rachmaninoff, or that he'd once turned down a crucial business meeting to attend a chamber music concert. When David watched Thomas play, something inside him shifted. He'd seen virtuoso performances before. He'd attended concerts at Carnegie Hall and La Scala. He'd heard some of the greatest living pianists. But this was different. This wasn't just about the music, though the music was extraordinary. It was about the story, the sacrifice, the love that had driven every decision Thomas made. David paused the video and stared at Thomas's face. The old man's eyes were closed, lost in the music, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. There was something profound in that image, something that spoke to the better angels of human nature. For years, David had been looking for the right project, something meaningful that would outlive him, something that would matter beyond quarterly earnings and stock prices. He'd considered building a new concert hall or starting another scholarship program, but nothing had felt quite right. It all felt too impersonal, too detached. Now, watching the 72-year-old man who'd sacrificed everything for love, David knew what he needed to do. He picked up his phone and called his assistant despite the late hour. "I need you to find out everything you can about Thomas Whitmore," he said. "Where he lives, his current situation, everything. And clear my schedule for tomorrow. All of it." His assistant, used to unusual requests, simply said, "Yes, sir." "Anything else?" David looked at the frozen image on his screen one more time. "Yes, find out if he still plays. I mean, really plays. And find out what kind of piano he lost." After hanging up, David sat back in his leather chair and allowed himself a small smile. He'd built his fortune on recognizing opportunity and acting decisively. But this wasn't about opportunity. This wasn't a business decision. This was about doing something right. Something good. Something that might actually matter. He didn't know Thomas Whitmore, but he understood sacrifice. He understood what it meant to make hard choices. And he understood that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe gives you a chance to help rewrite an ending. By morning, David would know everything he needed to know. And by afternoon, he'd be knocking on Thomas's door with a proposition that would change everything. But that night, as Thomas slept peacefully in his small flat and David finalized his plans in his penthouse, the video continued to spread. 50 million views. 100 million. It was becoming one of those rare moments that transcends the internet's usual chaos and noise. A moment of genuine human connection. People weren't just watching a talented pianist. They were witnessing proof that love and sacrifice still meant something in a cynical world. And they couldn't get enough of it. Thomas woke up the next morning to find his phone ringing constantly. He'd had the same phone number for 20 years, and usually it rang maybe once a week. Now it wouldn't stop. Reporters, music agents, people claiming to be old friends he barely remembered. He stopped answering after the fifth call. The BBC reporter arrived at 2 o'clock, just as promised. She was a woman in her 40s named Patricia, and she had kind eyes that reminded Thomas of his sister. She brought a small camera crew, but they were respectful, quiet, professional. They didn't push or pry. They simply let Thomas tell his story in his own words. Sitting in his modest living room surrounded by photographs of Grace, Thomas talked about his life. About the early days of promise and possibility. About the phone call that changed everything. His mother's voice breaking as she told him Grace had collapsed. About the decision that had taken him exactly 30 seconds to make. Everyone thought I was crazy, Thomas said, his hands folded in his lap. My manager begged me to reconsider, said I could hire the best care in the world for Grace and still have my career. But it wasn't about the care. It was about being there. She was scared. She was 19 years old and facing death, and she needed her big brother. Patricia asked him if he ever played during those years. Thomas smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. Every single day, I'd play for Grace in the evenings. It was the only thing that helped with her pain. The doctors couldn't explain it, but when I played, she could relax. Sometimes she'd even sleep. Those were the best moments, watching her face go peaceful while I played. The interview lasted 2 hours. When it was over, Patricia thanked him and promised the piece would air in a few days. But she had a feeling, based on the way her producer was already on the phone with the studio, that it might air much sooner than that. Just as Patricia and her crew were packing up to leave, there was a knock at the door. Thomas answered it to find a man standing in the hallway. He was well dressed but not flashy, wearing an expensive but understated suit. He looked to be in his late 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind simple glasses. Mr. Whitmore? The man said. My name is David Chen. I wondered if I might have a moment of your time. Thomas hesitated. He was tired from the interview and overwhelmed by all the attention. But something about this man seemed different, calmer, more genuine. I suppose so, Thomas said, stepping aside. David entered the small flat and immediately noticed the photographs on the wall. He walked over to them slowly, studying each one. Your sister? He asked. Grace, Thomas confirmed. She was the best person I ever knew. David nodded, still looking at the photos. My mother was a piano teacher, he said quietly. She died when I was 17, cancer. I would have given anything for more time with her. You gave your sister 30 extra years. That's remarkable. They sat down and David got straight to the point. I watched your performance at the station. I've watched it several times, actually. You have an extraordinary gift, Mr. Whitmore, Thomas shrugged. Had, perhaps. That was a long time ago. No, David said firmly. Have present tense. What I saw yesterday wasn't the echo of old talent. That was mastery. That was art at the highest level. He leaned forward slightly. I have a proposition for you if you're willing to hear it. Thomas felt a flutter of nervousness in his chest. I'm not interested in a comeback tour or recording contract if that's what you're thinking. I'm too old for all that, David smiled. That's not what I'm proposing. Though I should mention, I'm not in the music industry. I work in technology. But I fund various programs related to music education and appreciation. It's a passion of mine. He pulled out a tablet and showed Thomas some photos. A beautiful old townhouse in Belgravia, one of London's most prestigious neighborhoods. The building was 4 stories tall with elegant windows and a red brick facade. I purchased this property last month, David explained. I've been looking for the right purpose for it. After seeing your performance and hearing your story, I think I've found it. Thomas looked confused. I don't understand. I want to turn this building into a music conservatory, David said. But not for the children of wealthy families who can already afford the best instruction. For kids who would never otherwise have access to classical music education. Kids from difficult backgrounds. Foster children. Refugees. Children who need music in their lives but have no way to access it. Thomas felt his throat tighten. That's a beautiful idea. I want you to run it, David said simply. As the master teacher and artist in residence. You'd have a salary, of course, a generous one. And there's a flat on the top floor of the building that would be yours, fully furnished including a Steinway Model D grand piano. Thomas stared at him, unable to speak. A Steinway Model D was one of the finest pianos in the world. He'd played one once decades ago, and remembered the feel of it like yesterday. I can't, Thomas finally managed. I appreciate the offer, truly. But I haven't taught in 50 years. I wouldn't know where to start. You'd figure it out, David said confidently. The same way you figured out how to care for your sister. The same way you've figured out everything else in your life. Besides, you wouldn't be alone. We'd hire other instructors to help. But those children need someone like you. Someone who understands that music isn't about fame or money. Someone who knows what really matters. Thomas looked back at the photographs of Grace. What would she say if she were here? He already knew the answer. She'd tell him to do it. She'd tell him to stop hiding and step back into the light, even if it felt scary. There's more, David continued. I've also arranged for you to record an album of your original compositions with the London Philharmonic Orchestra. They're very excited about it. All the proceeds will go toward funding music therapy programs in hospitals, in honor of Grace. That did it. Thomas felt the tears come, hot and sudden. Why, he asked. Why would you do all this for someone you don't even know? David was quiet for a moment. Because I can, he said finally. Because I've spent my life building companies and making money, and none of it means anything if I can't use it to help people. Because your story reminded me of what my mother used to say. She said music has the power to heal, to connect, to transform. You proved that by giving up everything to care for your sister. Now I want to help you prove it to a whole new generation. Thomas wiped his eyes. I don't know what to say. Say yes, David said with a gentle smile. Or at least say you'll think about it. Before Thomas could respond, his phone rang again. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. It was the music student who had recorded the original video. Her name was Jennifer, and she was calling because she'd been contacted by dozens of her fellow students at the Royal Academy. They all wanted to meet Thomas. They wanted to learn from him. There's actually something else, Jennifer said, her voice excited. A group of us want to organize a benefit concert. A proper performance, not just at the station. We'd perform some pieces and then you'd be the headline. We could raise money for music education programs. What do you think? Thomas looked at David, who was watching him with an encouraging expression. He thought about Grace and how she'd always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. He thought about the little girl who'd pushed through the crowd to watch him play, her eyes full of wonder. Maybe it was time. Maybe after 50 years of putting everyone else first, it was okay to step back into his own life. Yes, Thomas said into the phone. I think that would be wonderful. Jennifer squealed with delight and started rattling off plans. Thomas half listened, still processing everything. When he hung up, he turned to David. I'll do it, he said. The conservatory, the recording, all of it. But on one condition. Name it, David said. The conservatory has to be named after Grace. The Grace Whitmore Conservatory. She deserves to be remembered. David stood and extended his hand. I wouldn't have it any other way. They shook on it, two men from completely different worlds brought together by music and a viral video. As David left, promising to have his lawyers draw up the paperwork, Thomas sat back down in his chair and looked around his small flat. In a few weeks, this wouldn't be his home anymore. He'd be living in Belgravia, teaching children, preparing for a concert and a recording. His life was about to change completely one more time. He walked over to the photographs of Grace and touched her face gently. Look at what you've done, he whispered. Even now you're still taking care of me. Outside, the world continued to watch and share his video. The view count had passed 200 million. Celebrities were talking about it. News anchors were discussing it. The story of the hidden pianist was becoming one of those cultural moments that defines a time. But for Thomas, sitting in his quiet flat with memories of his sister surrounding him, none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that he'd get to play again, really play, and this time, he'd be playing not just for Grace but for all the children who needed to know that beauty and hope still existed in the world. The phone rang again. This time Thomas smiled and answered it. 3 months passed in a blur of activity that Thomas could hardly believe was real. The townhouse in Belgravia had been transformed into something magical. The Grace Whitmore Conservatory was everything David had promised and more. The main floor held 3 practice rooms with upright pianos. The second floor featured a beautiful recital space with seating for 50 people. The third floor was dedicated to group lessons and music theory classes. And on the top floor was Thomas's new home. The flat was bigger than anywhere Thomas had lived in decades. Large windows let in natural light that made the whole space feel warm and alive. But the centerpiece was the piano. The Steinway Model D sat in the main room like a work of art, its black finish gleaming, its keys pristine and perfect. The first time Thomas played it, he'd cried for 20 minutes before he could even finish a single piece. The conservatory had opened its doors 2 weeks ago. 50 children had been selected for the first year, ranging from ages 7 to 16. They came from all over London, from circumstances that ranged from difficult to heartbreaking. Foster kids who'd never had anything they could call their own, children from families struggling to make ends meet, refugee children who'd left everything behind, kids who'd never imagined they could learn something as beautiful as classical music. Thomas had been terrified that first day. What if he couldn't teach anymore? What if he'd forgotten how? But the moment the first child sat at the piano, a shy 9-year-old boy named Oliver who'd spent 2 years in foster care, Thomas found that teaching was like playing. His hands and heart remembered everything. "Don't think about getting it perfect," Thomas told Oliver gently, guiding his small fingers to the correct position. "Just feel the music. Let it tell you what it wants to be." Oliver had played his first scale that day, and the look of pure joy on his face had made everything worthwhile. In the weeks since, Thomas had watched these children transform. They came in quiet and unsure, carrying the weight of their difficult lives. But when they played even simple exercises, something shifted. They stood taller. They smiled more. They started to believe they could be good at something. Today was special. Today was the benefit concert that Jennifer and her fellow students had organized. It was being held at St. Pancras Station, in the same spot where everything had begun. The station had given permission to set up a proper stage area, complete with professional sound equipment and seating for 500 people. Tickets had sold out in less than an hour, with all proceeds going to fund more programs like the Grace Whitmore Conservatory. Thomas stood backstage watching the crowd file in. He recognized faces from 3 months ago. The elderly woman who'd remembered him from 1973 was there, sitting in the front row with her friend. The businessman who'd missed his train was there with his wife. The young mother with the stroller had come back, her baby now a bit bigger but still calm and quiet. Jennifer appeared beside him, looking elegant in a long black dress. She was scheduled to perform first, playing one of Thomas's original compositions that she'd learned from the viral video. "Are you nervous?" she asked. Thomas smiled. "Terrified, actually." "Good," she said, squeezing his arm. "That means you care. That means it matters." The concert began. Jennifer played beautifully, her interpretation of Thomas's composition bringing tears to many eyes. Other students from the Royal Academy followed, each performing pieces that had meaning to them. The level of talent was extraordinary, but what moved the audience most was the obvious love these young musicians had for their art. Then it was time for a surprise segment that Thomas had insisted on. One by one, 5 children from the Grace Whitmore Conservatory took the stage. They'd only been learning for 2 weeks, but Thomas wanted the world to see what was possible when you gave children a chance. The first was Oliver, the shy 9-year-old. He walked to the piano with careful steps, sat down, and played a simple version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. His technique wasn't perfect. He missed a note near the end. But he played with such concentration and pride that the audience gave him a standing ovation. Oliver stood and bowed, his face glowing with happiness. 4 more children followed, each playing simple pieces, each receiving the same enthusiastic response. A 12-year-old girl who'd arrived in London as a refugee 6 months ago played Ode to Joy. A 14-year-old boy from foster care played a piece he'd written himself, just 8 bars long but entirely his own. Each child represented a life that was being changed by music. Thomas watched from the wings, his heart so full he thought it might burst. This was what Grace would have wanted, not fame or recognition, but impact. Real, meaningful change in the lives of people who needed it most. Finally, it was his turn. The announcer's voice rang out. "Ladies and gentlemen, the man who brought us all here today. The man whose love and sacrifice reminded us what truly matters. Please welcome Thomas Whitmore." The applause was deafening. Thomas walked onto the stage, his legs feeling steadier than he'd expected. He sat at the piano, the same public piano he'd played 3 months ago, though it had been tuned and maintained carefully for this event. He looked out at the audience, at all these faces watching him with anticipation and love. "Thank you all for coming," he said into the microphone. 3 months ago, I came here to play for my sister on her birthday. I thought I was saying goodbye to music one last time. Instead, I found my way back to life. So this performance tonight is dedicated to Grace, who taught me that love is always worth the sacrifice. And it's dedicated to all of you, for reminding me that it's never too late to begin again. He began to play. The piece was new, something he'd composed in the last month. He'd titled it Grace's Gift. It started soft and melancholic, reflecting the pain of loss. But gradually it built into something hopeful and bright, representing the unexpected joy of this second chance he'd been given. As he played, Thomas saw people in the audience crying. But these weren't sad tears. They were the tears that come when something touches the deepest part of your soul. When you witness something pure and true and beautiful. He transitioned seamlessly into other pieces. Some of his original compositions from 50 years ago, preserved in his memory all this time. Some classical pieces that Grace had loved. And finally, he returned to the lullaby he'd played that first day. The one that had started everything. The final note hung in the air, and for a moment the entire station was silent. Then the applause came like a wave crashing over him. People stood, cheering, crying, celebrating not just the music but everything it represented. Second chances, the power of sacrifice, the possibility of redemption, the truth that it's never too late to make a difference. Thomas stood and bowed, tears streaming down his face. He looked up at the ceiling of the station, toward the sky beyond, and whispered, "Thank you, Grace." After the concert, people lined up to talk to him, to shake his hand, to tell him how his story had affected them. A man in his 50s said Thomas had inspired him to reconnect with his estranged daughter. A young woman said she'd decided to pursue music teaching instead of a more lucrative career because of him. A father said he'd started spending more time with his kids after watching the viral video. The elderly woman who'd recognized him 3 months ago gave him a long hug. "I knew you were special all those years ago," she said. "But you're even more special now. Not because of your talent, but because of your heart." As the crowd finally began to thin, David appeared with news. The recording session with the London Philharmonic was scheduled for next month. The album would be released in the spring. Major music publications wanted to interview him. Television shows wanted him as a guest. But more importantly, 50 more children had been selected for the next session at the Grace Whitmore Conservatory. And David had already identified buildings in 3 other cities where they could open similar programs. Thomas's second act wasn't just about his own redemption. It was about changing the lives of hundreds, eventually thousands, of children. That night, Thomas returned to his flat above the conservatory. He sat at the Steinway and played quietly. Not for an audience, not for recognition, just for himself and for Grace. The music filled the room and spilled out the windows into the London night. He thought about the long road that had brought him here. The sacrifice that had seemed like an ending, but turned out to be a beginning. The sister he'd loved enough to give up everything for. The unexpected gift of a second chance he'd never imagined possible. His phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer. The concert video was already trending online, heading toward another 100 million views. But Thomas didn't open it. He didn't need to see the numbers or read the comments. He already had everything he needed. He had purpose. He had music. He had the opportunity to make a real difference in the world. And he had the memory of Grace, who taught him that sometimes the greatest achievements aren't measured in applause or acclaim, but in the quiet moments when you choose love over ambition, sacrifice over success, connection over recognition. Thomas played on into the night, his fingers dancing across the keys, his heart finally at peace. The hidden billionaire had stayed hidden, working behind the scenes to change one man's life. But the real gift wasn't the money or the opportunities. It was the reminder that no matter how long you've been lost, no matter how much time has passed, it's never too late to find your way home. And home, Thomas now understood, wasn't a place. It was this feeling, this purpose, this chance to take everything he'd learned from a life of sacrifice and use it to help others find their own voices, their own music, their own reasons to believe that beauty still exists in the world. The last note faded into silence. Thomas looked at the photograph of Grace he'd placed on the piano. She was smiling in it, the way she'd always smiled at him when he played for her. "We did it," he whispered. "Together, we did something that matters." And in the quiet of that moment, in a beautiful flat in London, a 72-year-old man who'd been forgotten by the world finally understood that he'd never really been lost at all. He'd just been waiting for the right time to be found.